When deciding on a textbook for my AP US History students, I looked around and found that obviously all the textbooks will cover the content that students need to cover, right? We all know that all textbooks are going to cover that. But when I'm selecting a textbook for use with AP US History students, I want a textbook that not only covers the content that the students are going to need, but is also organized in a way so that the students can best understand that content in the context of the AP US History curriculum, and a textbook that within its covers will provide both myself and my students with the tools that are necessary to master the historical thinking skills of the course, to master the reasoning processes that students need to work with, and to effectively integrate all of that into a resource that we can turn to. So I choose to use America's History because it is organized in the way that the AP curriculum for US history is organized. So the textbook, like all textbooks, is divided into chapters, but America's History also takes those chapters and divides those chapters into the periods of history as they are identified by the College Board in the AP US History curriculum and exam description. It's also important that a textbook within its covers, without going to any other resources, has the tools that the teacher and the students need to master skills. And so there are several things in America's history that I find particularly effective as a teacher. One of those things is the incorporation of both primary and secondary sources in the text of the chapters. One of the skills that's critical for AP US history students to develop is the ability to read and interpret secondary sources. Reading and interpreting secondary sources, understanding arguments made by historians and the way in which historians defend their arguments with evidence is a critical skill for AP US history students. The sections in America's history called Comparing Interpretations, which appears in 16 of the chapters in America's history, provides me as a teacher with many opportunities to bring in this idea of looking and understanding the historian's craft, what it is the historian does when the historian writes an argument, as well as helping students develop the ability to read and interpret a historian's argument, right? So what I tell my students is when you're reading the chapter, you are interpreting content. And as an AP US history student, one of the things I'm going to ask you to do is use your understanding of content to draw conclusions about the arguments made by historians, and understanding that historians as a discipline interpret information and draw conclusions, and they make arguments using evidence. So the comparing interpretations sections provide me as a teacher with two different interpretations of a historical event or a time period or a movement. And then I can engage my students with understanding how those historians came to their conclusions. I can ask my students to think about the kind of evidence the historians used, or perhaps the kind of evidence they chose not to use. So thinking about claims and evidence in sources. I can ask my students to evaluate the argument made by two different historians about content that we are studying, which engages them in understanding argumentation. And then I can also use those two different historians to engage my students in practice activities. Primary sources are included in every chapter in firsthand accounts. So as a teacher, I know I can turn to those tools for class discussions, for assignments, and to bring students sort of directly into conversation with primary sources and content. In each chapter of America's history, students and teachers will find a section called Thinking Like a Historian. This section provides a set of primary sources that teachers and students can engage with to develop lesson activities if you're the teacher, and of course to develop reasoning skills and historical thinking skills if you are the student. So in America's history, Thinking Like a Historian incorporates 7 or 8 primary sources, typically of a variety of types, that help give students the opportunity to practice their historical thinking skills and to use the reasoning processes, causation, change in continuity, as well as comparison, in developing the skills that are necessary to be successful in AP US history. For example, in the Thinking Like a Historian section entitled The Irish in America, students will find a variety of primary sources, both text-based and visual, that engage them in thinking like a historian by incorporating historical thinking skills such as document analysis, so basically looking for claims and evidence in a source. Students will be engaging in contextualization by placing those primary sources into the context of the broader history of the chapter that they are covering. And as a teacher, I can use this Thinking Like a Historian section of the textbook in a variety of ways in my classroom. Obviously, I can have my students individually or in groups engage with these 7 or 8 primary sources and practice the document-based question skills that students need, including document analysis, extended analysis of the sources. We can engage in developing a thesis in response to a prompt. Each of these sections includes a DBQ style exercise or essay. Or I could choose as a teacher to take these 7 or 8 primary sources and develop several different prompts that I have groups of students engage with to practice all 3 reasoning processes. Another way that I have used the Thinking Like a Historian section is to take the 7 or 8 primary sources and actually divide them up into separate groups. So have 7 groups of students, each with a different primary source, and use the primary sources after we do some document analysis and maybe some extended analysis. Actually use those primary sources to have students think about where multiple choice questions come from and how multiple choice questions are written on an AP exam. And so after we've done some document analysis, actually having small groups of students construct AP style multiple choice questions with a theme, right? So one of the themes of history must be incorporated. Every chapter in America's history involves a section called a visual activity. The visual activities in America's history provide students within the text with an opportunity to practice a difficult skill, and that is the ability to do document analysis on a painting, a political cartoon, or a photograph. Now, while our students, of course, in their daily lives engage with visual media all the time, their ability to effectively analyze visual media as a historian. So, the visual activity that is available in each chapter of America's history gives my students an opportunity to practice those skills. One of my favorite ways to use the visual activity in America's history is as an opener or bell ringer with my students based on a lesson or activity that we are getting ready to engage in. The AP margin notes that students will find in America's history throughout the text are a tremendously important feature for supporting my students' reading of the text. So America's history includes margin notes on AP skills and processes and margin notes on AP exam tips. Both of these margin notes, which the students will find throughout the textbook, support their development of effective reading skills. So one of the things as an AP teacher that we are teaching our students is to be effective readers of high level text that is dense with content. And so these margin notes, the AP skills and processes, help to teach students how to be more effective readers. The margin notes are there to guide students in finding and pulling out key information that relates to the AP US History curriculum and exam description. One of the parts of America's history that I find to be most useful in developing instructional activities and planning instruction for my students is the section at the beginning of each part of the text. So the parts corresponding to the periods of history. Each part of the textbook begins with a section called Making Connections Across Chapters. And this feature in America's history is so useful in introducing a period of history. For example, Part 3 in America's history covers Period 3 in the AP US history curriculum, which looks at the developments from 1754 to 1800, that formative period of the American Revolution and the early Republic. I will engage my students by looking at the making connections across chapters for Part 3 in America's history. This section will give students an overview of the kinds of questions and the kinds of developments that they are going to be looking for as we study 1754 to 1800 and as they engage in the reading and interpretation of chapters 5 through 7 in the textbook. So, in the curriculum and exam description for AP US History, each unit begins with a topic that contextualizes the entire period. So, Unit 3 in the AP US History curriculum and exam description begins with a contextualizing Period 3 lesson or topic. And using the Making Connections Across Chapters feature in America's history, I can help give my students the broad questions that we are going to examine as we are looking at Period 3. In addition, each chapter includes lots of practice questions at the end in the chapter review. In every chapter review, I have access to short answer questions. I have access to long essay questions. I have access to a DDQ at the end of each part or period of history, so that I have lots of opportunities to engage my students in all of the skills and the skill building activities that are crucial to being successful in AP US history.